Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from Egypt. His name is Dr. Robert Mason, and he's just published a book. The title of the book is New Perspectives on Middle East Politics, Economy, Society, and International Relations. And he was the editor, but also a contributor to a number of sections within the book. Dr. Mason is a fellow of the Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization Project at Lancaster University, a non-resident fellow with the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and currently sits on the International Studies Association Foreign Policy Analysis Section Executive Board. He was Associate Professor of Middle East Studies at the American University in Cairo from 2016 to 2019. Also a visiting scholar at the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University in 2019, and a visiting research fellow at the University of Oxford in 2016. His research focuses mainly on the international relations of the Middle East, including Gulf politics, Euromed, and Middle East Asia relations. Dr. Mason is the author or editor of numerous books, including Reassessing Order and Disorder in the Middle East, Regional Imbalance or Disintegration in 2017. Also, Egypt and the Gulf, a renewed regional policy alliance, 2016. Muslim minority state relations, violence, integration, and policy, 2016. International politics of the Arab Spring, popular unrest and foreign policy, 2014. And then foreign policy in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and economics and diplomacy in the Middle East, 2014. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot of history, a lot of geopolitics, but Dr. Mason can talk more about that. So Dr. Mason, are you there?
I am. Great to be with you.
All right, great. Thanks for agreeing to the interview. I mean, you have a long background. Can you talk about what led you to write this book, New Perspectives on Middle East Politics?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a fairly long journey over the past decade, starting off with my PhD in Iranian and Saudi foreign policy at the University of Exeter, which was really building on my interest in international relations. And then moving to Egypt in 2013 and staying here for the last 8 years or so, and witnessing various events, but also teaching students, not only in Egypt, but also from around the world on contemporary aspects of the region, and finding some textbooks and some literature on the subject of Middle East politics, not really covering all the contemporary issues, and certainly not necessarily all the issues that my students and colleagues would encounter on a sort of day-to-day basis. So really mixing up some of the sort of traditional thematic issues, such as the Arab-Israeli conflict, and building a more sort of forward-looking chapters, such as political economy, on looking at demography and youth, and soft power, for example, and how they interact in sort of contemporary relations. So that was sort of the motivation, really, is that teaching at the graduate level and trying to provide a primer, if you like, for both undergraduate and graduate students, really, and anyone else who is interested on what's happening in the region today.
Right. And I mean, there's been a lot of changes really in the near future. Can you talk about your introductory chapters, really about demography and the youth and how that's changed the economy of the Middle East? And can you talk about the impact of demographic change?
Yeah, I mean, what's been happening in the region for some time, really, has been this rapid population growth, and this has kind of fed into the Arab uprisings and the issue of resources versus growing populations in many cases, but also this sort of expectation as more and more youth become educated. I mean, it's a very diverse and multifaceted subject, so it also links in with things like the environment and what youth are up to from a very young age, including things like use of public spaces, road safety, how you use outdoor civil space, and the potential for changes in the education market, the job market, the politicization and function of patronage networks, how it touches on issues in the Arab Gulf states today, which is this move from frontier state economies into diversification, and how the expectations of youth now are really turning towards, well, if I've got this degree, I'm looking for a much better job, and I'm really looking for a good salary, and that isn't necessarily always assured, especially in a dynamic and fluctuating marketplace. We've seen that with COVID, amongst other things, such as the decline of oil prices in 2014, which have had an effect. So vision strategies in these regions also have an effect, and I think for demography and youth in particular, this idea of the youth bulge is really important, and expectations, and as I say, how it interacts with this transition towards private sector economy, income, and even things like marriage, where the costs involved, require that young people have steady income and are able to be upwardly mobile.
Right. So you have this pressure. I think you wrote in your book the population has grown from 92 million to 349 million within 50 years by 2000. So you have, and also I think it's a crisis if there's 30% of the population, what you use the acronym MENA region. The consequences of that have short and long-term effects, right?
Yeah, but this is an issue which affects the whole region, but it's also segmented into states which have particularly high population growth and which have not necessarily the resources to cope with that kind of growth. So we have to look at the frontier economies which derive the large proportion of their state income from oil and gas, for example, and those economies, particularly in North Africa, for example, which are less able to draw on income from these kinds of natural resources. So it's in those cases where there's significant difference and significant tensions also in how these states have to restructure themselves, either reliant on the IMF and other agencies, or trying to find alternative solutions, either domestically trying to grow new industries or looking to other countries to provide these kinds of solutions.
Right. And that also, would you agree that this kind of difficulty for some of these states to adapt to the growth in demographics has led to this phenomenon of migration out of the Middle East?
Certainly that's part of it, but I would say there's also security issues which need to be taken into account. I mean, Libya is a very good example of how insecurity has facilitated the kinds of push factors into the Mediterranean and beyond from the Sahel region, and how even in the Gulf, the actual migration routes are shifting because we've got this transition to favour this indigenous support for the local population and jobs for them. And so we find that one of the second, I think it's the second largest migration route in the entire world is between Asia and the Gulf, or Gulf Pacific, and that's shifting markedly. So these millions from South Asia now are being repatriated during COVID. It's on the back of decline in the oil price, and they're trying to ensure that these kinds of jobs, which have traditionally been blue collar jobs and therefore linked up with mega projects as well in the Gulf, they're being scaled back during the times of COVID, and it's becoming a difficult aspect of migration, which is becoming more addressed, I think, through diversification. So maybe other opportunities going forward for these states to engage, for these migrants to engage in new kinds of jobs potentially going forward.
And you write in your book that the Middle East is known as this war-torn region. You use an example of somebody who started in Morocco and tried to get to Turkey, all of the different difficulties crossing national borders it would be for that person. Can you talk about how you define the Middle East and also the conflicts that are taking place between these states?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's of course this concept of the Greater Middle East, which is what George W. Bush came up with when he talked about Afghanistan, of course, and there are commonalities, in terms of religion, and in terms of culture and traditional linkages, transnational linkages, whether it's ideology or trade and investment patterns. But what we're really talking about in the book is this region that spans from Morocco in the west right through to Iran in the east, and down to Sudan in the south. And of course, there's other states which are closely tied into that. And it's very interesting to see how these alliance patterns have been shifting recently through informal and temporary alliances. And in terms of regionalism, though, there's significant differences. So a lot of these relationships have been with Western partners, and we discussed that in some of the later chapters on extra regional actors such as the British, the French, Americans, Soviets, and Russians, and the EU and China, and have tend to favoured bilateral relationships due to various conflicts which still remain unresolved, whether it's the Western Sahara with Morocco and other conflicts such as between Saudi and Iran, tensions still there. Whether it's the Qatar crisis, there's all these impediments, of course, the Israel and Palestine conflict, all these impediments to a lack of regionalism, which has significant consequences for cohesion, for national development patterns, regional development patterns, and mobility as well.
Right. Now, it is remarkable how that there's similarities in kind of the ethnicity or pan-Arabism, but still these lines that were drawn back Sykes-Picot still exist today in the Middle East. Can you talk about kind of you have a chapter about how the military affects some of these states, and particularly you talk about Egypt and Lebanon and Iran. Can you talk about why that military involvement in these countries is so unique and is an important part in analyzing each of those states?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of this content is derived from my colleagues who work particularly on civil-military relations, such as Robert Springborg, and they've been really key to defining how these states operate and what their relationship is to civil society wherever it exists, or at least to the society, the nation that exists. So, for example, in Egypt, Lebanon, and Iran, there's discussions surrounding Praetorian republics, with Iran at times being labeled as a conditional democracy during, especially Khatami's first term as president, where there was more positive engagement with the West, where there was potential for further diplomacy to lead to a normalized relationship. That didn't occur. And what we see is this regression back to more hardline politics, and that's really affected how the state interacts with the society in that case. There's also bunker states, which are particularly evident in places like Algeria, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Sudan. But this isn't necessarily a static definition, and there is some discussion about how these states have developed over time. Sudan's interesting because it's going through a political transition right now, but with signs that there's calls for Bashir to come in. The signs are not necessarily positive for the future political development, but there's still this discussion, and the same is true in Algeria with Al Hirak movements, that there is potential for movement there. And there's also these monarchies which have been better placed to engage in the global system, relied on Western security backing since before they were founded as states, pre-32 in the case of Saudi Arabia, pre-71 in the case of other smaller Gulf states. And so there's this diversity of statehood in the region. And within that chapter on civil-military relations, we also discuss things like decision-making in Western capitals, particularly in Washington, about how foreign aid is spent, because much of it is done with military assistance programs in mind, and arms, of course. And it's notable, for example, that states such as Saudi Arabia stopped aid to the Lebanese army in 2016 because there was a lack of condemnation for the Iranian storming of the Saudi embassy in Tehran at the time. And so it's recognition, really, that non-state actors are also a big piece of the puzzle, because Hezbollah, of course, has been widely implicated in the state issues, state crisis in Lebanon, as we've seen. Right. And there's also talk of how Iran's military, its domestic suppression of dissent through the Basij forces, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' asymmetric approach to warfare in the Gulf, its missile development and nuclear program, has affected diplomacy, including the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but also how we gauge the region in terms of resolving conflicts. There's talks, obviously, in Iraq right now between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But the issue clearly is that there's wider issues at stake, not only necessary to normalizing Iran's international relations, but also stabilizing the regional balance of power. And I'm not sure that's really been taken on board in many cases. The focus has been on the nuclear issue, but there's also these other grievances dating back since the Iran-Iraq War, for example, the clashes during the Hajj in Mecca, and other sectarian politics which have been used for domestic purposes. These all have a role to play, not only in civil military relations, but also in broader diplomatic calculations.
Right, and I think that's kind of the theme of your book. At least you state in the intro is that it's really hard to make generalizations about what's going on in a very complex, kind of fluid environment in the Middle East. And I mean, you call the region a penetrated region. Can you explain that term and what has happened? Kind of the Middle East it's almost like a chessboard. People have moved these pieces around, larger powers from outside or extra regional actors. Can you talk about why it's penetrated and how that happened?
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating issue. It's not my term, but penetrated region really refers to this idea that there's for a long time been a history of actors which have either been receptive or induced by foreign actor interest. And whether it's been historically for oil, reasons related to oil and energy, arms transfers and so on, or diplomatic reasons, or indeed what's happening now in case of China for economic reasons, as well as what I call dual use, strategic exports, this idea of selling technology, smart and safe cities and so on. There's always been this sort of foreign actor interest and search for alliances, and that's partly because we have a whole range of states, particularly the oil-rich states, which have sought external protection for regime stability and security. That's been an enduring feature, really. And so Chapter 6, which charts the fall and rise of extra-regional actors, really goes through this sort of history of diplomacy, the complexity of European and EU policy in the region, the increasing strategic relations between China and the Gulf states, and increasingly in North Africa as well, and how it's moved from this economic and oil-dominated relations to much more targeted, what I call monetization, economization, and militarization. So with partners such as Russia, we see this joining of interests. States want to establish joint ventures. They're looking for further joint investments, and they're focused on arms in many cases and on building closer indigenous capacity. And that's partly because of these vision strategies to establish more industries which are dual use or might be overtly defensive, and partly to ensure their own security going forward. Because there's this issue that there's been questions raised about relations with the US. These other actors, such as Russia and China, are able to take advantage of these interests to build this indigenous capacity and contribute to it in many economic spheres.
Gotcha. And so you talked about the U.S. involvement. Your section, really, you talk about Trump, you talk about some of these more recent involvements of the U.S. and I think it was what was Trump's idea. He had some Trump's deal of the century. Can you talk about kind of American recent policy on the Middle East and its impact?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm looking at in my next book, which is looking at the Abraham Accords and how it's developing with a lot of the GCC states in mind, and how it's been really conditional in tying up relations with the US and Israel, and building bridges, if you like, to the Gulf states in many cases. It's something which is usually been developing with security in mind. So the transfer of technology for with missile defense, for example, considerations, I think is a top priority. What was allegedly supposed to be Houthi attacks and has more recently been attributed to Iranian attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, Cake and Khurais. This is something which knocked off so much Saudi oil capacity and threatens and continues to threaten continues to threaten Saudi interests is a major consideration. So establishing strategic depth for Saudis and Emirates, I think, is a top priority. But then, of course, there's all these other issues besides. So in the framework of moving past the Yemen conflict and Khashoggi and building more positive relationship between the Gulf states and the US, I think it's a signal, if you like, to, especially within the tolerance framework of the Emirates, to ties with Israel. It builds on technology, it builds on security, it builds on tourism, and it builds on investment, the kinds of aspects which are going to be vital in making sure that these states are able to transition into post-frontier states after 2030. And so it's multifaceted. And of course, some states are not quite there yet. Of course, for Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accords is something which is yet to be considered in full. Bahrain, of course, has signed up to this kind of deal. But for many reasons, including the 2002 Arab Peace Plan, including Saudi domestic considerations and its regional credentials and international credentials as an Islamic power, it's quite complicated in how this will be played out going forward. But a lot of it is to do with how particularly young leaders in the region perceive threats. And so it's going to be functional and related to how diplomacy with states such as Iran takes place and how that is moving forward, or indeed if there's issues, then there might be alternatives to explore to make sure that kind of national security is available.
And talking about young leaders, you have this kind of new leader in Saudi Arabia. Was it Mohammed bin Salman? I don't know much about the conflict with Yemen. Can you explain why that conflict started and still continuing, and why it hasn't been resolved?
Well, it's an incredibly complex theatre. I think the easiest way to conceive this conflict is to break it down into the three conflicts that are taking place. One of them is between the Houthis and the central government, and that's largely due to how the Houthis perceive the fact that they've been marginalized over the past few years and that their grievances have not necessarily been addressed. The second interest is Saudi Arabia pushing back against, and that's primarily its reason for intervention in 2015, pushing back against the perception of the Iranian influence on the Arabian Peninsula, which is simply not tolerated. And the third conflict is really the US or Western conflicts against terrorists, against groups such as Islamic State or Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and that's really done from afar and can increasingly be done from over the horizon through the use of drones and so on. And so it's incredibly diverse. What we see is the Emirates has pulled back from the Yemen recently and has been able to establish its relationship with the Southern Transitional Council in the south, which has given it proxy leverage, if you like, to safeguard its interests going forward. It's also developed access to Socotra Island and Mayun Islands towards the Red Sea, which gives it power projection into the region. And because of this complexity, because of this overlapping interest, it's very difficult, as we've seen, to find a solution to this conflict. And I mean, even now, there was talk recently, I think in the last couple of days, that the Iraq talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran were premised on the idea of resolving the Yemen conflict. But how could that possibly be when, okay, the Houthis may have received arms from Iran, but that doesn't make the Houthis an Iranian proxy per se. They still have autonomy. And in order to resolve the Yemen conflict, there needs to be some negotiation with the Houthis directly in order to re-establish more favorable facts on the ground, which, as we know, has led to this humanitarian crisis in many ways.
And would you think that the Yemen crisis is something that plays out in the long-term kind of conflict and tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
It's certainly a contributing feature and one of the most important for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But let's not forget Syria in all this, and other struggles for regional influence, which has taken place particularly after the Arab uprisings had upended the regional order and facilitated this transition from protests to warfare in so many different theatres. This complexity of trying to resolve these very embedded now conflicts with external intervention. In the case of Syria, you've got Russia taking the lead, not only on the ground with Iran, but also in diplomatic terms. And in Yemen, as I said, being so compromised by these overlapping interests, it's incredibly difficult to resolve these and to try to move ahead with a sort of logical progression of phased-in confidence-building measures to really get to the center of the overarching conflict, which is not necessarily in all these different areas. It's what has been going on for the last few centuries in terms of the sort of political, religious narratives, the sectarianism that's been going on, which has been added to and accumulated by not only confrontation during, for example, Iran-Iraq war in 1984, I think it was, when the Saudis shot down 2 Iranian jets, but also the introduction of the US as a local actor following the Gulf War and the US-Iranian contentions and how that's really complicated and caused a real triangle of relations between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the US. So trying to unpick this Gordian knot and trying to figure out what comes first, is it confidence building measures? JCPOA clearly is one of the first places to start, since that was so successful in the past. But as I would argue, I don't think it's the be all and end all in terms of actually increasing aspects which could favour better engagement going forward.
Right, and you talk about kind of the Israel-Palestine conflict as happening, but also shaping regional politics. Can you talk about the impact of the continuing conflict between those two parties and how it affects surrounding nation states?
I'm sorry, which two parties?
Well, I was just saying that you have a section where you talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, but how it's regionalized. It's not just happening between the Palestinians and Israel. It affects other neighboring countries.
Well, a lot of the content is to do with how Iran has perceived the conflict, how it's adapted its position on Israel in order to provide its political legitimacy. It certainly puts the defense of Palestinians at the forefront of its political objectives, and has done for many years. But it's very interesting to see that in the onset of the maximum pressure policy from the US and from the ongoing Syria conflict, it's not easy. It's also linked, of course, into the civil military relations, whereby the military aspect, in this case the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which sort of is a parallel entity and serves as this sort of foreign arm for the revolutionary ideology in military terms, has preferred to engage and push ahead with a very aggressive support for Hezbollah, for example, and to make sure that it conducts continues to conduct an offensive agenda against Israel. Now, that, of course, for the domestic population can be problematic when more and more the economy is under pressure from sanctions, and it's additional problems linked to COVID, for example, and linked to political groups which are trying to stake a claim, particularly during recent elections. We've seen in 2009 the rise of the Green movement, for a more plural and rationalized, if you like, ideological approach, not only to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but to Iranian international relations more broadly defined. We're starting to see the grass shoots of an Iranian foreign policy under President Raisi, who is trying to regularize and rationalize its regional interactions, and that, of course, falls into the category of the US into the category of discussions going on with Saudi Arabia. But whether it's able to succeed in doing so is yet to be determined. And until that takes place, until the tensions drop to a point where the threat perception also drops, it's going to be very difficult to move ahead with anything resembling sort of more normalized relations. And no one's assuming that that's going to affect its relationship with Israel. But certainly there'll be movement in the right direction if at least some of its core contentions with regional parties were resolved. The benefit of President Raisi, of course, is because he's coming from a hardline perspective and he has perhaps better relations with the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, is that should there be movement in negotiations, whether it's a JCPOA or other forms of diplomacy, that coherence, if you like, of what has been a sort of hardline takeover of most of the branches of government may actually play into a more coherent policy. Whether that plays out in actual fact is yet to be determined.
And how do you see this change in U.S. administrations affecting Middle East politics? Do you see a continuation or a continuum, or do you think that the Biden administration will have changes in their Middle East policies?
Well, I think they have already, and even before the President Biden was inaugurated, even during the transition period, we see the effect that it's had on various states, and particularly in the Gulf region.
Nope, looks like he's not going to make it back. So again, that was Dr. Robert Mason, and the title of his book is New Perspectives on Middle East Politics, Economy, Society, and International Relations, published 2021. And you can probably find his contact information through where he is in Egypt, which is the American University in Cairo, I believe, is where you can find his website. So again, Dr. Robert Mason, thank you.